flowering plants are really interesting in terms of how they achieve sexual reproduction. There's much more going on inside of the flower than you maybe appreciate when you see a beautiful flower sitting in a field when you're out on a walk, but this discrimination between self and non-self pollen is a really active process that goes on inside of flowering plants. I am an evolutionary geneticist, and I'm really interested specifically in mate choice mechanisms in flowering plants. So trying to understand how flowering plants distinguish between more or less desirable potential mating partners. And I'm also really interested in the evolutionary consequences or implications of these mate choice decisions over long evolutionary timescales. Phlox is a genus of wildflowers that grow throughout North America, and I in particular study the annual phlox, a beautiful, very charismatic wildflower that grows in the spring in Texas. So my biggest focus right now in the research that I'm doing is understanding a mechanism that in plant biology we call self-incompatibility. So self-incompatibility describes a mechanism where flowering plants are able to specifically recognize self versus non-self pollen and selectively choose the non-self pollen to reproduce with. So this is a mechanism to prevent self-fertilization, which can be really detrimental because of inbreeding and the costs of inbreeding. We know that self-incompatibility has evolved many, many times throughout flowering plant evolution, and different species or groups of flowering plants use different mechanisms to recognize and reject self-pollen. And in the species that I study, it's clear that it has evolved a mechanism that we have never before characterized. And so that's really what I'm focusing on doing right now, is understanding what the genetic basis and the molecular mechanism of that self-incompatibility mechanism is that we've never been able to characterize before. Understanding self-incompatibility in flowering plants is important because the degree of self-fertilization that occurs within a population or a species has really important consequences for the long-term evolutionary trajectory of a species, and also for how species persist in their environments. So we know that self-incompatible species, so species that are able to prevent self-fertilization using these genetic mechanisms, are actually experiencing lower extinction rates overall than species that do not have these active genetic self-incompatibility mechanisms to prevent self-fertilization. And so if we want to understand how the diversity of flowering plants came to be, we really need to understand the mechanisms of self-incompatibility and their sort of long-term evolutionary consequences. We have a responsibility as people to understand the world around us, and particularly in this moment where there is pretty severe biodiversity loss and also incredible changes in our environment. This is really an opportunity to think deeply about the organisms that live around us, and also an opportunity to learn from them.